So Unit 4 is all about how studies are designed in statistics. And real generally, there are two types of studies. You have observational studies and you have experiments. So basically in an observational study, researchers observe things that are already occurring in a population. And it could be something that they're actually physically watching and taking notes, or it could be something such as they give a survey and they kind of see how people's opinions already are, or what they're already doing as far as maybe how much caffeine they're drinking daily. So if they're asking the question of something that's already occurring, then it's an observational study. If it's an experiment, well, then the researchers are actually implementing some type of what we call a treatment. Which a treatment, it doesn't necessarily have to be an actual physical treatment. It could just be something that they're changing in either the lives of people or changing something for the life of animals. It could even be changing something in soil for plants. So if they're changing something, then it's now an experiment. And then they're basically trying to see what happens because of their change. So we can kind of look at these two examples and see whether or not we think an experiment was done or an observational study was done. And these are actual studies that were done some years ago. So the first one says, over a 4-month period, among 30 people with bipolar disorder, patients were given a high dose of omega-3 fatty acids from fish oil improved more than those given a placebo. So if you don't know what a placebo is basically a fake treatment. So in this case, the treatment was fish oil, and the placebo would be something that looked like a fish oil but had no active ingredient in it. So, and it says that the patients who were given a high dose of the fish oil improved more than those given the placebo. So right there, we should identify that there was actually an experiment being done because there was a treatment. The minute you see a treatment, you know you have an experiment. So a similar study could be done in more of an observational format, or maybe a researcher who has access to patient records gathers a sample of people with bipolar disorder and then surveys them to ask them basically, do you take fish oil regularly, yes or no? And from that, they can go ahead and basically track or follow the patients who said yes and the patients who said no over a 4-month period and compare them at the end to see whether or not those that were taking fish oil improved more than those that weren't. So that's the way it could have been observational, where they're basically just observing what's already occurring and they're not actually given the treatment of fish oil. So the minute they're given something, it sounds like they changed something in their lives, therefore it becomes an experiment. One main thing to take away from experiment and observational studies is in an experiment, you can actually show cause and effect relationships. So you can say that fish oil is causing people with bipolar disorder to get better. But if they did an observational study, they couldn't say that fish oil caused it to happen, even if it kind of showed the trend of improvement. They would just be able to say there's a correlation between them, a positive correlation between them. All right, so in the second example, it says the leg muscles of men aged 60 to 75 were 50% to 80% stronger after they participated in a 16-week high-intensity resistant training program twice a week. So in this example, hopefully you notice that it just basically says these men, their leg muscles got stronger after they participated in a 16-week high-intensity resistant training program. It doesn't say that they were assigned to participate in it. It just says after they participated. So the researchers could have easily just went to a gym and found men that were already in this program and just kind of watched to see what happened to their leg muscles. So nowhere in here did it say they were actually assigned to one. So therefore, it's an observational study rather than an experiment. So on your guided notes sheet, there is an actual snipping from an article called Does Social Media Cause Low Grades? So I would recommend pausing that now just to read it so you can answer the 2 questions that go along with it so that you're kind of still flowing with the whole guided note sheet. So if you pause now, do that, and then unpause. So let's go ahead and review 2 vocabulary words that we talked about in other units, but that are also important when discussing how to design studies and statistics. So remember that a population is basically the entire group of individuals or things or objects, animals, plants, whatever it is. It's the entire group of those things. And remember that a sample is just a part of that population. So it's just like a small group of the people that we're discussing, or the items we're discussing, or the animals we're discussing. It's just a small group of that. So we talked about a census in the beginning of the course a little bit, where we said that it's basically where researchers are able to go around and get the information about the entire population. The United States tries to do this every 10 years, where they go around and ask information of all the households, and it's just not always feasible to do if you're not the government. For instance, if we wanted to figure out information about every single student at McEachern High School, it might be hard to actually make sure we got information from every single student. There could be students absent, there could be students just hard to reach, there could be students who don't want to answer. So it's kind of challenging at times to get information about an entire population, which is why researchers just select a sample of people and ask them the question, and then they basically make inferences or assumptions or suggestions about the population based off of that information they get from the sample. So the important thing is that researchers actually select a sample that is a good representation of the population. The method that researchers go about actually selecting people for a sample is called sampling. So that is the actual method that researchers will go about selecting people. Now, they want to make sure they select a sample that represents the population well. So, for instance, if they're interested in students at McEachern, they wouldn't want to just select 12th grade students and interview them. Well, if their population of interest is all of McEachern students, that wouldn't include 9th, 10th, and 11th grade students. So therefore, it wouldn't be a good representation. Now, if their population of interest were just seniors at McEachern, well, then that would be a perfectly fine sample to get. So how can they actually make sure they include all the different subgroups inside of a population when they're actually selecting people or things for a sample? So there are actually 6 methods of sampling that we're going to discuss, and 4 of those 6 ways are actually good methods of selecting a sample. And the reason why they're good is because they include random selection. So when you actually include some type of way to randomly select people in a population where everyone in the population has a choice to be selected, but they're randomly selected, then that's actually a good sampling method. Whereas there are 2 ways that aren't so good because they don't include random selection. So let's go ahead and first talk about the good ways of sampling. So the first of the 4 good sampling methods would be just a simple random sample. That could be just picking names out of a hat, or using a random number generator to generate student IDs, or something of that such where it's just very random. So I know your guided note sheet asks for a quick description and a sketch. So a quick description could just be something like picking names out of a hat. And then actually, my hats always look like toilets. But if you just draw like a hat, I don't know why my hat has to look like one of those magic top hats. It, like I said, always looks like a toilet. But anyways, I just kind of just show picking names out of a hat like this as a quick sketch. Maybe you guys can make your hats not look like toilets. But yeah, so that would be something like a quick sketch that you can do. And just a quick description could be picking names out of a hat. That's the most relatable one that I can think of, picking names from a hat. So take a second and maybe pause and draw your quick sketch and a description in that box. All right, the next one is a systematic sample. So basically a systematic sample is where you are selecting people or things or objects in a systematic order. So this could be like selecting every other person in line, or selecting every 10th person, or selecting every 100th person on a list. So basically you're doing it in a very systematic fashion. It could be selecting every 5th bottle off of the Coca-Cola belt at the Coca-Cola company. So basically it's like selecting every some number thing or item or person. And the easiest sketch I can think of is if you create people or some type of, I'm going to use stick figures, but show that you're selecting every so many, maybe every other, every third, by just circling every third or every second. You don't want to get too crazy with the number because then you'll have to draw a whole bunch of stick figures to do that. But there's my little quick sketch, and then I could just circle every other person. And then my quick description would be selecting every second person or every other person, something like that. So take a second and create some similar sketch in the box on your guided notes. All right. And the next one is a stratified random sample. So this is the third of the good ways to sample, because all these include some type of random selection. Oftentimes students get this one and the very next one mixed up, and it's basically because they both include groups. So with a stratified random sample, basically you have what's called strata, which are groups. You actually decide as a researcher how you want your groups split up at first. So if you are interested in selecting a few students from every grade level, well, then first you would actually have to split your students into grade levels. So maybe you have all the 9th graders, all the 10th graders, all the 11th graders, and all the 12th graders. So you already have predetermined groups. And then from there you determine, okay, now I'm going to randomly select 10 people out of each grade level. So therefore you just have a stratified random sample because you're choosing some from each group. That's how that differs from the next one. So with a stratified random sample, you're choosing some from each group. You're not leaving any group out, some from each. So basically a picture for that could be, let's say we have our groups. I'm just going to make groups with circles because it's going to be a little bit easier, and I'm just going to put 3 groups, and I'm going to put X's this time as people so I don't have to really draw a whole bunch of stick figures. So let's say we have groups. You already have groups. And then you want your picture to show that you're choosing some from each group. And it doesn't have to be the same amount of people in every group or things or objects. But then to show you're choosing some from each, I'm just going to go ahead and circle 2 from group 1, 2 from group 2, maybe 2 from group 3. So my quick description would be choosing some from each group, and really emphasize each group because you actually have to have some representation from each group. That's what makes it a stratified random sample. So choosing some from each. Really emphasize that each. That's an E, believe it or not, group. Alright, so choosing some from each group. That is our stratified random sample. If you need to pause. Make sure you get a similar picture on your guided note sheet. So the fourth of the good ways to sample, or to select a sample, is a clustered sample. Once again, it includes groups. So the difference is you're choosing whole groups in a cluster sample. So maybe we do have groups 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, etc. So let's say we have our groups 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. So the difference is we're not choosing some from each this time. We're actually choosing whole groups, so whole clusters. So maybe we chose everyone from 9th grade and everyone from 11th grade to represent our sample. That is a cluster sample because you're choosing whole clusters, not some from each. So if you look at the difference, a stratified random sample is choosing some from each group, whereas a cluster sample is just choosing whole groups, and some groups just won't be selected. So if you wanted to actually draw a picture that didn't actually relate to grade levels or anything in specific, you could just draw a similar picture as we had the last time, and that's kind of a good way to show that you can tell the difference between the two. So if you just draw groups like we did on the last slide for stratified, so very similar. And I'm just using X's as items, but then show you're choosing the entire group of items or things. So you can choose one whole group, you could choose 2 whole groups, but basically if you chose them all, they would be the whole population. We don't want them all. But basically you're choosing some whole groups to be your sample. So let's go ahead and review the 4 good ways of sampling. So all these 4 ways included some type of randomly selecting participants. So cluster sample, remember, is where you're choosing whole clusters. And a stratified sample is where you're choosing some from each group. A systematic sample is where you're choosing every 10th person, every other person, something like that. And a simple random sample is basically something as simple as choosing names from a hat or choosing numbers off of a list that correspond to people, maybe with a random number generator, something like that. So now let's go ahead and talk about the 2 bad methods of sampling. So if a researcher doesn't select people in some type of random way, then they can actually include bias in their results, which would make the results not as valid. And researchers do this. I mean, this happens because they do what's either convenient to them or they like to take on voluntary responses. So let's say, for instance, a researcher wants to know if the people in the community thinks that a new college football stadium should be built. And let's say they went ahead and said, you know what, I'm going to go to the next game and ask the people as they walk in if they think that a new football stadium should be built. Well, right then and there, you should see that their sample is not a very good representation of the whole community, because they're asking people who are fans, who, if they ask people who are walking into a football game, hey, do you think we should build a new stadium? Then they may actually be more in favor than just everybody in the community. So therefore, that would actually be a bad way to sample. And that's actually the first bad way of sampling, called a convenient sample. So a convenient sample is basically where a researcher chooses individuals that are very easy to reach, people who are around them, and they don't really go about selecting the sample in a random way. It would be basically if I was interested in maybe student opinions about the lunch at school. If I just sit outside my door and ask the people who walked into my classroom, well, that would be very convenient, but it wouldn't necessarily be a good representation of the population. So the second bad way of sampling is a voluntary response sample. And this is actually used a lot by radio stations or by retailers or television networks. Anytime they ask a person to either call in or to go to a website or to complete a survey, that is definitely a voluntary response sample. You would have to self-select. You are selecting you to go on and call or go onto the website and complete the survey. They're not selecting you. You are. So if you ever completed one of those surveys on the back of a receipt at like Panda Express or McDonald's or Subway, where it says, get a free cookie if you complete the survey, get a free third item if you do the survey online, then you were a voluntary response sample. You volunteered yourself to be a part of their survey. I've done it. I get my third item all the time at Panda Express. But yeah, sometimes retailers actually give us things or incentives to actually do their surveys. But in all, it's not going to be the best for their research to get the opinions of people who are willing to go on and do something or give their opinion. They really want the opinion of all their customers. But it's kind of hard for them to do, especially in their environment where they would have to walk up to people randomly and ask them. It's not really feasible. But their voluntary response samples will tell them some information about their company. It just won't be very reliable. Now, just to kind of wrap up here, hopefully you can answer these questions and relate them to what you've basically learned in this video. So, number 1, a parent of a football player is concerned about proposed budget cuts to the athletic program, so she asks spectators at the game if they agree with the cuts. So based off of that information, what type of sampling do you think she used? So remember, there's 6 methods of sampling. There are the 4 good ones and the 2 bad ones. So hopefully you think about it a little bit and you think that she did a convenient sample. So if you think that she did a convenient sample, that is correct. So remember that the results aren't going to be very valid because she asked people who are actually at the game whether or not they agree with the budget cuts to the athletic program. So there will definitely be biased results. The second question is, what type of sampling design do shows such as American Idol, Dancing with the Stars, America's Got Talent, and The Voice use? So take a second and think. Hopefully you are thinking of a voluntary response sample because people are self-selecting. They're having to call in to actually give their opinion. So they actually have to choose to pick up the phone and call themselves. So that is a voluntary self-selected sample. Or it could be text message or whatever it is, but they are choosing to do it themselves. And then the last question, how are clusters and strata different? So think about the two different types of sampling, cluster sample and stratified sample. So remember, those both involve groups. So hopefully you're thinking about the clusters where you're choosing whole groups, where in stratified sampling, they're just choosing some from each group. So clusters is whole groups, stratified sampling is some from each group. And that wraps it up.